Blake Morin slid the new org chart onto the screen and erased my title in front of the entire company. Just like that. Lila's strength has always been compliance, he said smoothly. We need velocity. 300 employees stared at the projection as my name dropped from Chief Internal Controls Architect to Emerging Markets Recovery Unit, the division that had burned $38 million the year before. The numbers were still fresh in everyone's mind. Apparently, so was my usefulness. No one objected. Silence is a corporate survival skill. I kept my hands folded on the table. If you're still here with me, tell me what time you were listening to this story and leave your lucky number in the comments. Consider it a silent act of protest. Now, let me tell you what happened next. For context, since Blake conveniently skipped that part, I built our internal control framework after the IPO, every certification workflow, every reporting safeguard. I drafted the executive compensation policy from scratch. And when the SEC tightened enforcement standards, I wrote the mandatory clawback clause requiring recovery of executive bonuses if financial statements were ever restated. Blake had been CEO for 14 months. He liked earnings calls that sounded like victory speeches. He despised anything that slowed momentum, especially risk language. Let's see if governance can actually generate revenue, he finished, flashing a reformer's grin. A few polite laughs echoed, carefully measured. No one wanted to be remembered as the wrong kind of loyal. I didn't argue. I didn't defend my record. I didn't remind him that governance is what keeps velocity from driving off a cliff. I gave him none. That evening, just after 9, my inbox chimed, Internal Audit, subject line Q2 Revenue Recognition, clarification required, 3 contracts, $24.7 million. Timing concerns, velocity, I thought, tends to arrive early. Before we go any further, a quick note, some elements of what you're about to hear are dramatized and enhanced with AI to sharpen the storytelling and highlight the lessons behind it. This story isn't about any specific real person or company, it's about patterns, power, and the price of arrogance. I hope you stay with me to the end. Now, let me tell you what happened next. Walking into the Emerging Markets Recovery Unit felt less like a transfer and more like being escorted to a controlled burn. The division had lost $38 million the previous year, and now I was supposed to fix it without asking inconvenient questions. Unfortunately for Blake, asking inconvenient questions is what I do. Within my first week, I reviewed the Q2 numbers. 3 contracts totaling $24.7 million had been recognized before performance obligations were fully satisfied. Another $9.3 million in operating expenses had been deferred into the next quarter. On paper, EBITDA appeared stronger by 6.2%. In reality, we were borrowing from tomorrow to impress today. I documented everything and sent a formal memo to Blake and the finance team. No drama. Just facts, citations, and the relevant accounting guidance. His response came quickly. We're not falsifying numbers. He wrote, We're optimizing timing. Optimizing timing. That was the new corporate synonym for gravity. Blake needed to hit the earnings per share target this quarter. If he did, 4 million performance shares would vest. If he missed, they wouldn't. The math was simple. The pressure was not. He asked me to sign off on the control certification tied to the division's reporting. I declined. In writing, I explained that recognizing revenue prior to contractual completion introduced material risk and required disclosure review. The next morning, I was removed from the Finance Committee distribution list. My access to weekly forecasting calls disappeared. By the end of the month, the stock was up 11%. Analysts praised our accelerated momentum. The market applauded, and the risk got louder. The morning the quarterly filing was due, the building felt strangely calm, like the air before a storm no one wanted to name. Earnings season does that. Smiles get tighter, language gets polished, risk gets rebranded as confidence, because we are publicly traded. The SEC requires a formal certification with every quarterly report. The CEO must sign a statement confirming that internal controls over financial reporting are effective. It is not ceremonial. It is legal. Blake Morin reviewed the final draft in the executive conference room, surrounded by counsel and finance leads who suddenly found their calendars very flexible. The line read, "Internal controls are effective and have not materially changed during the quarter." My name still appeared in the documented control architecture as the original architect of the framework. The governance map, the approval flows, the escalation pathways, they all traced back to systems I built after the IPO. Yet I had been removed from oversight discussions. Access restricted, certifications withheld. That is not a personal grievance. That is a control change. So I sent a memo, neutral, clinical. Material changes in personnel responsible for key controls may require disclosure evaluation under existing reporting standards. No accusations, no theatrics, just reference to policy. Blake's response was brief, noted, no material impact. Translation, move along. I didn't escalate. I didn't argue. I archived everything because control failures rarely explode. They drift. That afternoon, Blake signed the certification. Internal controls are effective. The filing went live. Analysts praised discipline. Commentators repeated the phrase operational momentum. I watched the webcast replay from my office in the so-called failing division, calm, detached, listening for what wasn't said. Then, 3 days later, an email arrived from our independent audit firm, subject line request for expanded revenue contract review. They wanted additional documentation on the same contracts I had flagged. Nothing accusatory, just procedural, which, in my experience, is how accountability begins. The auditors did not accuse anyone of fraud. They did something more dangerous. They recalculated. By the end of the week, their expanded review confirmed what I had outlined in my memo. Revenue tied to 3 contracts had been recognized before performance obligations were fully satisfied. Certain deferred expenses distorted quarterly comparability. The issue was technical, procedural, and entirely avoidable. There was no evidence of intentional misconduct, but the numbers were wrong, under reporting standards. That meant one thing, a restatement. The adjustment reduced quarterly earnings per share by 14 cents. On paper, that may not sound catastrophic. On Wall Street, 14 cents can erase confidence faster than any headline. Within 48 hours of the amended filing, the stock dropped 8%. Analysts who had praised accelerated momentum now used phrases like control weakness exposure and earnings quality concerns. The tension inside headquarters thickened, conversations lowered, calendar invites multiplied. Blake scheduled an emergency investor call. "It's a technical adjustment," he said calmly on the webcast. "There is no impact to long-term strategy. Our growth trajectory remains intact." He delivered the line with steady cadence. If you only listened to tone, you might have believed him. But markets don't trade on tone. They trade on trust. And trust had just been discounted. From my desk in Emerging Markets Recovery, I monitored the filings and cross-referenced the amended disclosures. The language was careful, the admission narrow, the implications wider. Internal controls had not failed completely. They had been overridden by optimism. The following Monday, another meeting invite appeared, this time from the Compensation Committee of the Board. Subject line review of executive incentive calculations. No exclamation marks, no accusations, just a procedural review triggered by the restated earnings. I leaned back in my chair and read the notice twice. Because when earnings change, bonus metrics change. And when bonus metrics change, contracts get revisited. The tension was no longer theoretical. It was contractual. At this point, do you think justice is finally knocking if you believe it is? Drop a 1 in the comments because your voice matters more than you think. And every perspective helps keep this conversation alive. The Compensation Committee meeting began without theatrics, which is usually how serious consequences enter a room. No raised voices, no dramatic accusations, just binders, spreadsheets, and the quiet weight of policy. Under SEC Rule 10D, 1. Publicly traded companies are required to recover certain executive compensation if financial statements are restated due to material noncompliance. The rule does not require fraud. It does not require intent. It requires only one thing: that the numbers used to calculate performance-based pay were wrong. Our numbers had been wrong. The amended filing reduced quarterly earnings per share. That single adjustment altered the metrics tied to executive incentives. Performance thresholds that had been met were no longer met. Shares that had vested no longer qualified. The finance team projected the impact on the screen: $12.8 million in restricted stock units, $6.6 million in performance shares, $19.4 million in total compensation subject to recovery. No one gasped. Professionals rarely do. But the silence thickened. Blake leaned forward, jaw tight. That clause was designed for fraud, he said, looking from one committee member to the next. We're not talking about misconduct. The outside counsel adjusted her glasses and spoke evenly. The policy does not require misconduct. It requires a restatement that affects performance metrics. Blake's voice sharpened. This is a technical accounting shift, and compensation is calculated on reported results. She replied. Those results changed. I remained at the far end of the table as an observer, not a participant. I had drafted the clawback language 2 years earlier, when enforcement standards tightened. I remembered the exact phrasing recovery applies in the event of an accounting restatement due to material noncompliance, regardless of fault. At the time, Blake had approved the final policy without revision. Now the policy was reading itself back to him. The chair of the Compensation Committee cleared his throat. We need to determine whether to formally initiate recovery procedures. Blake exhaled sharply. You're overreacting. The chair did not respond. Instead, he requested that management step outside while the committee deliberated. As Blake stood, he looked directly at me. Accusation unspoken but obvious. I met his gaze without expression. Minutes later, the committee reconvened. A confidential ballot would be conducted to decide whether to activate the clawback provision, for the first time since my demotion. The system was no longer theoretical. It was procedural. The press release went out at 8:30 in the morning, right as the market opened. Timing, for once, was no longer being optimized. The headline was clinical. Almost polite CEO compensation subject to clawback following earnings restatement. No adjectives, no outrage. Just facts arranged in a way that left very little room for interpretation. Within minutes, financial media picked it up. My phone began vibrating with alerts. Analysts updated their notes. Commentators framed it as a governance test case under the newly enforced clawback standards. By 9:15, CNBC had requested a live response from Blake. He accepted. From the conference room down the hall, I watched the broadcast on a muted screen. Blake sat upright, shoulders squared, expression carefully neutral. When the anchor asked about the clawback, he smiled thinly. This is a procedural matter, he said. We support strong governance. The adjustment was technical, not indicative of misconduct. His voice held steady, but his jaw tightened between answers. The anchor pressed gently about oversight and certification responsibilities. Blake redirected toward future growth initiatives. Markets, however, rarely wait for narrative control. By mid-morning, the stock slipped another 3%. Not catastrophic, but cumulative. Analysts began modeling the combined impact of the restatement, reputational risk, and executive instability. Words like credibility and board accountability entered the commentary. Inside headquarters, the atmosphere shifted. Assistants lowered their voices. Senior managers lingered near glass-walled offices, pretending to review dashboards while tracking headlines. Humiliation in corporate America rarely involves shouting. It unfolds through filings, tickers, and polite inquiries. Just before noon, a new development appeared in my inbox. A letter from one of our largest institutional shareholders, a fund that owned nearly 9% of outstanding shares. The letter requested that the board review the adequacy of executive oversight and supervisory controls related to financial reporting. It was measured language, respectful, strategic, but the implication was unmistakable. The clawback was no longer just about compensation recovery. It had become a question of leadership judgment. I leaned back in my chair and read the letter twice. Public disclosure had done what internal memos never could. It moved the conversation beyond policy. It moved it to accountability. The confrontation came faster than I expected. 3 days after the shareholder letter circulated, the board convened a special session. I was asked to attend for context. Blake arrived early, jaw set, eyes sharp with something that looked less like confidence and more like calculation. He didn't wait long to speak. "She weaponized compliance," Blake said, gesturing toward me as if I were an exhibit. Lila knew exactly how the clawback provision would function. She positioned this. There, it was the counterattack. Not against the policy, against me. I kept my voice steady. "You certified the controls." The room quieted. Blake leaned forward. "You created unnecessary friction. You escalated minor timing adjustments. I documented revenue recognition concerns." I replied, "In writing." The chair of the audit committee asked for the documentation. The general counsel projected the email chain onto the screen. My memo was dated 3 weeks before the filing. It referenced the contracts in question, cited accounting guidance, and advised evaluation of disclosure implications. Blake's reply followed immediately beneath it. No material impact. The sequence spoke for itself. One board member adjusted his glasses. Another flipped through printed copies of the certification Blake had signed. No one interrupted. No one rushed to defend him. Blake shifted strategies. Controls were operational. He insisted. There was no fraud. We corrected timing. That is precisely why Rule 10d1 applies. Outside counsel said calmly, "Fault is not required." For the first time, Blake seemed to recognize the terrain had changed. This was no longer a narrative debate. It was governance. The board began asking questions I hadn't heard before. Why was the control owner removed from oversight discussions? Were disclosure risks evaluated independently? Each answer Blake offered sounded thinner than the last. I did not gloat. I did not elaborate beyond what was asked. Facts, when allowed to stand alone, have their own momentum. After 2 hours, the chair cleared his throat. "We need to consider broader leadership implications," he said. 2 directors exchanged a look. One of them spoke carefully. "I propose we initiate a formal confidence review." The words hung in the air, heavier than any accusation, because once confidence becomes agenda item, outcomes rarely stay symbolic. The vote took place behind closed doors. Exactly as governance requires, when confidence is no longer assumed. I was not in the room for the ballot itself. I didn't need to be. The atmosphere in the hallway told me everything. Directors moved with quiet efficiency. No raised voices, no drama, just process. After nearly an hour, the board chair stepped out and asked Blake to return inside. 10 minutes later, it was over. Blake Morin was asked to resign. Effective immediately. The official language cited leadership misalignment and oversight concerns. In corporate translation, that means the board no longer believes you are an asset to shareholder value. Under the terms of his employment agreement, the governance clause triggered automatically because the departure followed a restatement and a loss of board confidence. Certain protections dissolved. He forfeited $8 million in severance that would have applied under a standard transition. He also lost the right to retain unvested equity grants tied to future performance cycles. There were no flashing lights, no security escort, no criminal charges. He was not prosecuted. The restatement had not involved fraud. It involved judgment. And judgment had consequences. That is how the system removes people at this level. Quietly, contractually. Blake exited the building that afternoon, carrying a leather portfolio. Not a cardboard box. A few executives avoided eye contact. Others offered restrained handshakes. Public statements thanked him for his service and strategic contributions. Markets reacted cautiously, The stock stabilized within 2 trading sessions. From my office, I watched the internal announcement populate the company intranet. Interim leadership would be assumed by the chair of the audit committee until a successor was named. Later that evening, I received a call from the same chair. "We'd like you to return to your prior role," he said, "with direct reporting to the board, no ceremony, no apology, just structure being restored. Cold justice rarely announces itself. It simply closes the loop." Restoration did not arrive as applause. It arrived as structure. When the audit committee chair asked me to return to my former position, I did not answer immediately. Titles had never been my concern. Reporting lines were, so I gave a single condition: internal controls would report directly to the board, not through the CEO's office. Oversight could not depend on executive comfort. There was no resistance. Within 2 weeks, the governance framework was formally amended. The reporting charter was rewritten. Control certifications required independent review before executive sign-off. Documentation protocols were tightened, not as punishment, but as reinforcement. I rebuilt the committee calendar first, then the escalation matrix, then the disclosure evaluation process that should never have been bypassed. The work felt familiar, steady, deliberate. Markets noticed stability faster than they admit. During the following quarter, earnings met expectations without creative timing adjustments. Guidance was conservative. Analysts described the call as measured, a word rarely used during Blake's tenure. By the end of that quarter, the stock had recovered 14% from its post-restatement low. One institutional investor publicly cited restored confidence in oversight and governance. Confidence, I've learned, is not loud. It compounds quietly. Inside the company, something subtler shifted. Senior managers began looping compliance into strategic planning discussions earlier. Questions about risk were no longer treated as obstacles. They were treated as inputs. That was the reform I wanted, not vindication, but integration. Late one afternoon, General Counsel forwarded me a brief update. Blake, through his attorney, had inquired about retaining a portion of equity that had technically vested before the restatement, but had not yet been settled. He argued that the performance targets were met in good faith. The Compensation Committee reviewed the request against the clawback policy language. The answer was concise: no exceptions. I closed the email and returned to revising the updated certification checklist. Governance does not celebrate. It endures. By the time the final decision was documented, the tension that had once filled every hallway was gone. Blake's request to retain a portion of the vested equity was formally denied. The Compensation Committee cited the policy language he had approved 2 years earlier. No reinterpretations, no discretionary carve-outs. $19.4 million did not disappear because the market panicked. It did not vanish because I plotted revenge. It was recovered because the compensation formula had been recalculated after a restatement, and the contract required alignment with corrected results. Cause, clause, consequence. That was the entire story. At the next board meeting, I presented the updated internal control framework and the revised reporting structure. There was no triumph in the room, only attentiveness. Directors asked about disclosure timing, audit coordination, and oversight safeguards. We discussed risk in plain language before we adjourned. The chair invited closing remarks. I kept them simple. Controls are not obstacles. I said, they are seat belts. No one applauded. No one needed to. Later that afternoon, Blake returned briefly to collect remaining personal files. He walked through the lobby without escort, without spectacle. A few employees nodded politely. Others kept typing. There were no headlines announcing his departure beyond the standard filing. No dramatic endings. Just a governance system operating exactly as it had been written. Justice, I've learned, rarely makes noise. It simply enforces the signature. What this experience taught me wasn't about winning. It was about structure. Systems don't protect people because they're kind. They protect people because someone took the time to build them carefully. I wasn't the loudest person in the room. I didn't outshout anyone. I documented. I certified. And I stood still when pressure tried to move me. That's not weakness. That's discipline. There's a difference between revenge and accountability. Revenge is emotional. Accountability is contractual. One burns fast. The other endures. If you were in that room publicly sidelined, quietly blamed, would you react? Or would you record? Would you argue? Or would you anchor yourself in facts? I'm genuinely curious. Where are you listening from right now? What city? What state? What country? Drop it in the comments. Every place carries its own version of power and pressure. If this story resonated with you, not because of the downfall, but because of the discipline, then you're already part of something bigger. When you subscribe, when you like, when you share this video, you're not boosting an algorithm, you're helping these conversations reach someone who may be sitting in their own boardroom, wondering if integrity is worth it. One subscription from you might help someone choose structure over silence. One share might shift someone from fear to clarity. This story was fully created and produced by our team. We do not copy or borrow content from any other channel. Thank you for staying with us and listening until the end.